Hello. Today I am going to tell you the story of how I would teach personal narrative writing to my students. At first, I thought that I would tell my students how to write this personal narrative, but as I started creating this lesson, it just got way too long to be accomplished in the 4 to 5 minutes required for this assignment. So instead, what I thought I would do is make a video teaching or telling the story of how I would teach this to students to share with other teachers. And I'm really also happy to talk about how I have included some of the Canva elements to be able to achieve this. So let's jump right in. This is how I would teach personal narrative, developing effective creative writing skills in my pre AP English 2 classes at my high school. The first thing that I'm always going to do is we're going to talk about the learning objectives. These are set by our school, so we'll just make sure that we have those. We can always check back on those as we go throughout our lesson. Next, we are going to let the students choose their prompt. I would let them read those, think about them, and then I will show them how I would write this essay with a dream deferred, where I am writing about a time when I had a dream, a goal, or a plan that did not go the way that I expected. How did that experience change my perspective and teach me something about myself? Next, I liked using some of Canva's elements, such as this kind of interactive or highlighting element to focus on the fact that we're going to write an engaging hook and introduction. And then the standard I'm covering here is developing the topic and the point of view. So this is how I would instruct students in what the hook and introduction are and a few different ways that they can create their own hook and introduction. I also liked that as I am presenting this, the setting, the establishing conflict, and the sensory details and descriptive language are not there. So, what I would actually do as I'm clicking through the slide is I would read my example introduction to them, and then I'd be able to click and add the setting, establishing the conflict, and the sensory details, which are part of the developing the topic and writing the engaging hook and introduction that are the standard that I'm teaching for this assignment. After we talk about the hook and introduction, we want to provide a little bit of context as we are building rising action. So again, I would just get to teach the students about context and rising action, reminding students what those are. I'm sure that they know them. But what I like about this lesson is that we're going to talk about how context and rising action can be naturally woven together to build to the plot's climax. So again, I have my example for the students. Then, after I read my example, I would talk about that. I would go back and I would look at some of the elements that we had looked at on the previous slide, such as motivation, how the stakes, what stakes or the tension that is at play here, and then also the complications that are rising, that are leading to that climax. Excuse me. Next, I would teach the students about the importance of the climax, the turning point. And again, my learning standards that I want to make sure I'm including here are the descriptive details and the sensory language. So I include two different parts as I teach students about this. The importance of showing, not telling. We do this all the time. So instead of saying, I didn't make it and I felt bad, we are really going to use those specific details to show that situation to our reader. The coach's voice echoed across the gym, calling name after name that wasn't mine. My palms went clammy. The sound of the applause around me grew muffled and felt like I was underwater. So I'm really showing what that moment feels like instead of just telling I was embarrassed. And then finally, we're also going to talk about how we can use syntax for pacing, that shorter sentences such as another name, then another, not mine, my throat tightened. These can all create intensity before we include that longer descriptive sentence that can emphasize the emotion. I stared at the empty space where my name should have been. It's one thing to tell students how to do this, another thing to show them, like I'm asking them to do. So, we are going to make sure that we talk to them about how they can bring in the descriptive and sensory details, bringing those to life. What did you hear? What did you see? What did you feel physically and emotionally? Again, I have my example here. And as I talk about this afterwards, after I read my paragraph, I can bring in the shift. I'll show them the sensory details, show them how I'm using syntax to build the tension. And then, of course, I'm having sensory details. Before I set them off on your turn, I give them a little bit of scaffolding to encourage them to how do you lead into the moment? Describe those sensory experiences, reveal that emotional impact, and then including the first sign of change, which I also had on my example. Finally, the most important part of any narrative technique is going to be talking about the reflection and how I changed as a result of this experience. Here are a few different ways we can do that. We can think about our inner thoughts and internal dialogue. Again, that internal dialogue is is a narrative technique. Tonal voice and shift is a narrative technique. Symbolism and imagery, and also circular structure, those are also very important whenever we're thinking about how to create those narratives. Moving on, I have my final paragraphs of my personal narrative where I talk about the pacing, the dialogue, again, some of those elements that I had just introduced to students in the previous slide, the imagery, the shift, the all important shift, and then how my perspective changes over time. So here I am really showing them how we employ the elements that I just looked at. And of course, before I let them go, I'm going to give them a little bit more scaffolding. What should you think about? Before you begin drafting, you can look at this 2-column chart thinking about the climax. What was I thinking? What do I understand differently now? What did I want then? What do I value now? That is my reflection. Again, this is just to make sure that we are analyzing and not summarizing. And then to write the reflection, I kind of have a step by step process, the prompt, and then I have an example of that. And students can take these examples and they can weave these in as they're creating their own narrative. Then I'm going to end with just some tips for creating that powerful narrative, talking about their dream and their goal, using that sensory language, looking at conflict and emotion, and how our narrative really needs to be about growth, how we overcame it. Finally, I will end my presentation with my full example for my students so that they can refer back to it at any time and they can always go back to my slides for how to create this. I hope that you are able to use some of what you have learned here as you're teaching narrative to your own students. My final tip for us teachers would be, instead of using Mrs. Keener's example, which won't mean much to your students, I encourage you to think of a time that things didn't go as you planned in your own life. And since your students know you, that will mean so much more to them, seeing how you overcame that challenge and it really made you into the person that you are today. Thank you.